Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez had been in Iraq for 8 months when the convoy rolled into the most dangerous neighborhood of Fallujah. The sun hung low in the desert sky, casting long shadows between the concrete buildings that lined the narrow street. She adjusted her helmet and checked her rifle one more time, feeling the familiar weight of her gear pressing against her shoulders. The mission seemed routine enough. Intelligence reports indicated a high-value target was hiding in a compound 3 blocks ahead. Maria's team was providing security for the raid, making sure no one escaped through the back streets while the main assault team moved in from the front. As the lead vehicle in her convoy, Maria's Humvee carried 4 soldiers including herself. Private Johnson sat behind the wheel, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Corporal Davis manned the mounted machine gun, constantly scanning the rooftops for threats. Specialist Martinez rode shotgun, his eyes never leaving the road ahead. The radio crackled with updates from other units. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The target building was surrounded, and the assault team was preparing to breach the front door. Maria felt a familiar tension in her stomach, the kind that came with every mission in this hostile city. Fallujah had earned its reputation as one of the most dangerous places in Iraq. The city had seen intense fighting for months, and insurgents knew every alley, every building, every hiding spot. They moved like ghosts through the urban landscape, striking without warning and disappearing just as quickly. As their Humvee turned onto the target street, Maria noticed something that made her uneasy. The street was too quiet. Usually, there would be some civilians around, even in dangerous areas. Children playing, women hanging laundry, old men sitting in doorways. But this street was completely empty. She keyed her radio. Alpha 6. This is Rodriguez. Street appears clear, but something doesn't feel right. No civilian activity. The response came back immediately. Copy that. Rodriguez. Stay alert. Assault team is moving in now. The Markley and Rojan. Great Markley inside. Copy that, Rojan. Assault team is moving in now. Copy that, Rojan. Copy that, Rodriguez. Through her headset, Maria could hear the coordinated chatter of the assault team as they approached the target building. Everything was happening exactly as planned. The suspect was reportedly inside with 2 associates, and intelligence suggested they would not resist arrest. That's when the first shot rang out. It didn't come from the target building. It came from somewhere behind them, from a direction they hadn't expected. The bullet struck the rear window of their Humvee, spiderwebbing the reinforced glass but not penetrating it completely. Contact rear, Davis shouted, swinging the machine gun around toward the source of the gunfire. More shots followed, this time from multiple directions. Maria realized with growing horror that they had driven straight into a carefully planned ambush. The insurgents had used the main raid as a distraction, knowing that security teams would be positioned on the surrounding streets. Johnson floored the accelerator, trying to get them out of the kill zone, but the narrow street limited their options. Buildings rose on both sides, creating a canyon of concrete and steel that trapped them in the middle. The gunfire intensified. Maria could see muzzle flashes from several windows and rooftops. The insurgents had positioned themselves perfectly, creating crossfire that made it nearly impossible for the Americans to return effective fire while remaining mobile. A rocket-propelled grenade streaked past their vehicle, missing by inches and exploding against a building wall. Chunks of concrete rained down on their Humvee as Johnson swerved to avoid debris. "We need to get out of here," Martinez shouted over the noise. But as they approached the end of the street, Maria saw their worst nightmare. A roadside bomb had been planted at the intersection, probably triggered by a remote detonator. The explosion flipped a civilian car that had been parked nearby, creating an effective roadblock. They were trapped. Johnson slammed on the brakes, and the Humvee skidded to a stop about 50 meters from the roadblock. The gunfire was coming from all directions now, and Maria knew they had only one option. "Dismount, take cover," she ordered. The 4 soldiers scrambled out of the vehicle, using it as cover while they tried to assess their situation. The gunfire was so intense that Maria could barely hear her own thoughts. Bullets pinged off the armored vehicle, creating sparks and leaving deep gouges in the metal. Davis had managed to get behind his machine gun and was returning fire toward the rooftops, but there were too many targets to engage effectively. Every time he focused on one position, gunfire would erupt from another direction. Maria tried to contact the assault team on her radio, but the static was overwhelming. Either the radio was damaged, or the insurgents were jamming their communications. They were on their own. The situation deteriorated rapidly. A well-aimed shot disabled their vehicle's engine, eliminating any hope of a quick escape. Smoke began pouring from under the hood, and Maria realized they would have to abandon their primary cover. "Move to that building," she shouted, pointing to a partially destroyed structure about 30 meters away. It offered better cover and multiple exits. But getting there would mean crossing open ground under heavy fire. Johnson was the first to move. He sprinted across the street, zigzagging to make himself a harder target. He made it to the building safely, and immediately began providing covering fire for the others. Martinez went next, but he wasn't as lucky. A burst of automatic weapon fire caught him in the leg, sending him tumbling to the ground halfway across the street. He cried out in pain but managed to crawl the rest of the way to cover. Davis and Maria were still behind the Humvee when they heard the distinctive whistle of another incoming RPG. This one struck their vehicle directly, and the explosion knocked both of them to the ground. Maria's ears were ringing, and she could taste blood in her mouth. She looked around desperately for Davis and found him lying motionless about 10 feet away. There was blood pooling beneath his head, and he wasn't responding to her calls. She crawled over to check on him, keeping as low as possible to avoid the ongoing gunfire. Davis was unconscious but still breathing. She could see where shrapnel had struck his helmet, probably giving him a severe concussion. He would need immediate medical attention, but first they had to survive the next few minutes. The insurgents were getting bolder, moving closer to their positions. Maria could see armed figures darting between buildings, trying to flank their small defensive position. She knew that once the enemy got behind them, it would all be over. With enormous effort, she managed to drag Davis toward the building where Johnson and Martinez had taken cover. The distance seemed endless, and every few seconds she had to stop and return fire to keep the insurgents from advancing. A bullet struck the ground inches from her head, spraying her face with concrete dust. Another round caught her backpack, destroying her water supply and spare ammunition. She was running low on everything except determination. Finally, she reached the relative safety of the destroyed building. Johnson helped her pull Davis inside while Martinez, despite his wounded leg, maintained watch on their perimeter. The building had been heavily damaged in earlier fighting, with gaping holes in the walls and most of the roof missing. But it provided cover from multiple angles and had several rooms they could use to set up defensive positions. Maria quickly assessed their situation. They had limited ammunition, one seriously wounded soldier, no working radio, and an unknown number of insurgents closing in on their position. Their vehicle was destroyed, and the main assault team was probably unaware of their predicament. But they were still alive, and as long as they were breathing, she would continue fighting. The insurgents began probing their defenses, sending small groups to test different approaches. Maria and her team fought back with everything they had, making every shot count. The afternoon sun was setting, which would give the enemy additional advantages once darkness fell. As the battle continued, Maria began to realize that this was no random ambush. The insurgents had known exactly where the convoy would be and had prepared accordingly. Someone had leaked information about their mission, or they had been under surveillance for much longer than anyone realized. The gunfire intensified as more insurgents arrived to join the attack. Maria counted muzzle flashes from at least 8 different positions, meaning they were outnumbered 2 to 1 at minimum. The enemy had all the advantages: superior numbers, better knowledge of the terrain, and unlimited ammunition. But Maria had something they didn't expect. She had survived 3 tours of duty in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, and she had never given up on a mission yet. She wasn't about to start now. As night began to fall over Fallujah, the real battle was just beginning. The darkness brought a temporary reduction in the intensity of gunfire. But Maria knew it was just the calm before the storm. The insurgents would use the cover of night to move closer, and her small team would lose their ability to see attackers approaching from a distance. Martinez had managed to fashion a crude bandage for his leg wound using strips torn from his uniform, but he was still bleeding and growing weaker. Davis remained unconscious, though his breathing seemed more stable. Johnson had taken shrapnel in his left arm but was still able to fight effectively. Maria distributed their remaining ammunition carefully. Each soldier had approximately 40 rounds left, plus whatever they could salvage from Davis's equipment. It wasn't nearly enough for a prolonged firefight, but it would have to do. The building they occupied had been a small shop before the war, probably selling household goods to local families. Now its windows were blown out, the shelves were overturned, and bullet holes decorated every wall. But it had thick concrete walls and multiple rooms, which made it defensible. Around midnight, the insurgents made their move. The attack began with a barrage of grenades thrown through the windows. Maria and her team took cover in the back room as explosions shattered what remained of the shop's interior. Dust and debris filled the air, making it difficult to breathe. Then came the assault. Armed figures poured through the front entrance and the large window openings, firing automatic weapons as they advanced. The muzzle flashes lit up the interior like deadly strobe lights. Maria and Johnson returned fire from their defensive positions, forcing the attackers to take cover behind overturned furniture and debris. The gunfight was intense but brief. The insurgents quickly realized that the Americans were well positioned and still had plenty of fight left in them. After about 10 minutes, the attackers withdrew to regroup. Maria knew they would be back, probably with a better plan and more firepower. During the lull, she tried once again to get their radio working. The device had been damaged in the RPG explosion, but she managed to get intermittent static that might have been voices. She couldn't tell if anyone could hear her transmissions. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. 4 American soldiers trapped in Fallujah. Heavy contact. Need immediate assistance." She repeated the message several times, hoping someone was listening. The response, when it came, was barely audible through the static. "Rodriguez. Copy. Location." She gave their approximate coordinates and described the tactical situation as best she could. The voice on the other end was too distorted to understand clearly, but she thought she heard something about extraction and sunrise. Help was coming, but they had to survive until dawn. The second attack came just before 2 a.m. This time, the insurgents were more organized and better equipped. They had brought what sounded like a heavy machine gun, which they used to suppress Maria's team while other fighters maneuvered for better positions. The heavy machine gun rounds tore through the concrete walls like paper, forcing the Americans to huddle in the most protected corner of the building. Chunks of masonry rained down on them as the sustained fire gradually demolished their cover. Maria realized they couldn't stay in the building much longer. The structure was being systematically destroyed around them, and soon they would be completely exposed. But leaving meant crossing open ground under fire, which would be suicide with their current numbers and ammunition levels. That's when she noticed something that gave her an idea. The building next door had been completely destroyed except for its basement level, which was still intact. If they could reach it, they would have better protection and multiple escape routes through the connected basement systems that ran beneath this part of the city. The problem was getting there. The distance was only about 20 meters, but it might as well have been 20 miles, with the amount of firepower focused on their position. She explained her plan to Johnson and Martinez. They would wait for the next lull in the fighting, then make a running dash for the basement entrance. Johnson would carry Davis, despite his own injuries, while Martinez would provide covering fire despite his wounded leg. It was a desperate plan, but desperate situations called for desperate measures. The opportunity came around 3 a.m. when the insurgents stopped firing to reload and reposition. Maria gave the signal, and they moved. Johnson hoisted Davis over his shoulder in a fireman's carry and stumbled toward the basement entrance. Martinez limped behind them, firing short bursts at any muzzle flashes he could see. Maria brought up the rear, laying down suppressive fire with her remaining ammunition. They almost made it. Johnson had just reached the basement entrance when a burst of gunfire erupted from a new position. The insurgents had anticipated their move and positioned a team to intercept them. The first bullets struck Johnson in the back, and he collapsed with Davis still in his arms. Both men tumbled down the concrete steps, leading to the basement level. Martinez spun toward the source of the gunfire, trying to protect his fallen comrades, but more bullets found their mark. He was hit multiple times in the chest and fell backward against the basement wall. Maria saw her team members going down around her, and something inside her snapped. She had served with these men for months, had shared meals and jokes and fears with them. They weren't just soldiers to her, they were family. She charged toward the insurgent position, firing her weapon on full automatic and screaming at the top of her lungs. The sudden, aggressive assault caught the attackers off guard, and several of them fell back in surprise. But there were too many of them, and she had too little ammunition left. The first bullet hit her in the left shoulder, spinning her around and sending her weapon flying. The second caught her in the right leg, dropping her to one knee. Then they came in rapid succession: chest, abdomen, left arm, right thigh. She fell backward down the basement steps, landing hard on the concrete floor next to Johnson and Davis. Blood was flowing from multiple wounds, and she could feel her strength ebbing away with each heartbeat. The insurgents didn't immediately follow them into the basement, probably assuming that all the Americans were dead or dying. Maria could hear voices speaking in Arabic above them, discussing what to do next. She tried to check on her teammates, but moving was becoming increasingly difficult. Johnson was unconscious, but still breathing weakly. Davis remained unresponsive. Martinez had somehow made it to the basement entrance, but was clearly in critical condition. Maria counted 17 separate bullet wounds on her own body. She had lost so much blood that her vision was starting to tunnel, and her hands were shaking uncontrollably. She knew she was dying, but she also knew that giving up meant her team would die too. Using every ounce of willpower she possessed, Maria crawled to Martinez's position and took his radio. It was damaged but still functional. She managed to transmit one final message before losing consciousness. "This is Rodriguez. We're in the basement. Coordinates follow. Heavy casualties. Tell my family." The radio went silent. Above them, the insurgents were making plans to finish off any survivors and retrieve weapons and equipment from the dead Americans. They had won this battle, but they wanted to make sure there were no witnesses left to tell the story. In the basement, 4 American soldiers lay motionless in pools of their own blood. The concrete floor was cold against Maria's face as darkness closed in around her consciousness. She thought about her daughter back home in Texas, about the letter she had written but never sent, about all the things she would never get to say. The basement fell silent except for the slow drip of water from a broken pipe and the labored breathing of 4 dying soldiers. Dawn was still 3 hours away. Lieutenant Commander Jake Stevens had been leading SEAL operations in Iraq for 18 months, but he had never seen carnage quite like what intelligence photos showed at the Fallujah ambush site. 4 American soldiers had been missing for 48 hours, and the initial search teams had found only abandoned vehicles and blood trails leading into a maze of destroyed buildings. The mission briefing had been grim. Satellite imagery showed extensive damage to the area, and drone surveillance had detected no movement for over 24 hours. Most military analysts believed the soldiers were dead, but families back home were demanding proof, and no one wanted to leave Americans behind in enemy territory. Stevens assembled his best team for the search and rescue operation. 8 SEALs with extensive urban warfare experience, equipped for both combat and medical emergencies. They would insert by helicopter just after midnight and have 6 hours to locate the missing soldiers before extraction. The helicopter dropped them 2 miles from the target area to avoid detection. They moved through the city like ghosts, using night vision equipment to navigate the rubble-strewn streets without making a sound. Fallujah at night was a dangerous place, with insurgent patrols and improvised explosive devices hidden throughout the urban landscape. When they reached the ambush site, Stevens could immediately see why the initial rescue attempts had failed. The area was a tactical nightmare, with multiple vantage points for snipers and countless hiding places for enemy forces. The destroyed Humvee sat in the middle of the street, like a monument to the violence that had occurred there. Using hand signals, Stevens directed his team to spread out and begin a systematic search of the surrounding buildings. They had practiced this type of operation hundreds of times, but the reality was always more challenging than training exercises. The first building they entered had been completely gutted by explosions and gunfire. Bullet holes covered every wall, and the floor was littered with spent ammunition casings and debris. Bloodstains on the concrete told part of the story. But there were no bodies and no equipment left behind. The second building showed similar signs of intense fighting. Stevens could reconstruct the battle in his mind based on the physical evidence. Defensive positions behind overturned furniture. Ammunition scattered in specific patterns that suggested a prolonged firefight, and multiple entry points that indicated the insurgents had eventually overwhelmed the American position, but still no soldiers. It was Petty Officer Rodriguez who noticed the basement entrance. It was partially concealed by rubble, and would have been easy to miss in daylight, but his thermal imaging equipment detected a faint heat signature coming from below ground level. Stevens signaled for the team to converge on the basement entrance. They approached carefully, weapons ready, unsure what they might find in the darkness below. The smell hit them first. Blood, cordite, and human waste combined in a nauseating mixture that spoke of death and suffering. Stevens had encountered that smell before in Iraq, and it was never associated with good news. They descended the concrete steps slowly, using infrared lights to illuminate the basement without revealing their position to potential enemies. The space was larger than expected, probably connecting to adjacent buildings through a series of tunnels and storage areas. That's when they found them. 4 American soldiers lay scattered across the basement floor, so still and covered in dried blood that Stevens initially assumed they were looking at corpses. The scene was horrific. Bullet wounds were visible on all the bodies, and the amount of blood loss suggested that these soldiers had been fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds. But as Stevens knelt beside the nearest figure, he detected something impossible. A weak pulse. The soldier was a woman, probably in her early 30s. With staff sergeant stripes visible on her torn uniform, her body showed evidence of at least 17 bullet wounds, and she had lost so much blood that her skin was pale gray. By all medical logic, she should have been dead hours ago. Stevens immediately called for his medic while checking the other soldiers. 2 were clearly dead, but the third man was also somehow still alive, though barely. The SEAL medic, Hospital Corpsman First Class Thompson, went to work immediately with the advanced trauma care equipment they carried for exactly these situations. "This is impossible," Thompson muttered as he assessed the female soldier's condition. "Look at these wounds. She's lost at least 60% of her blood volume. I count 17 separate bullet impacts, including 2 that should have been immediately fatal." But impossible or not, Maria Rodriguez was still breathing. Thompson started 2 large-bore IVs and began pushing blood substitutes and coagulation factors into her system. Her blood pressure was so low, it was barely detectable, and her heart rate was rapid and thready. She was in the final stages of hemorrhagic shock, probably minutes away from complete cardiovascular collapse. The other surviving soldier wasn't much better off. He had multiple gunshot wounds and had been unconscious for at least 2 days. Thompson worked frantically to stabilize both patients while Stevens coordinated with the extraction helicopter. The situation became more complicated when insurgent patrols began converging on their location. Apparently, the enemy had been watching the area, waiting for rescue teams to arrive. Stevens found himself fighting a running battle through the basement tunnels, while his medic tried to keep 2 soldiers alive. "We need to move them now," Thompson shouted over the gunfire. "They won't survive much longer without surgical intervention." But moving severely wounded patients through active combat zones was extremely dangerous. Any additional trauma could kill them instantly. But staying in the basement meant certain death for everyone. Stevens made the call. They would fight their way to a more defensible position and call in the extraction helicopter, even if it meant exposing their location to enemy forces. The journey through the tunnel system was a nightmare. Stevens and his team engaged multiple insurgent positions, while Thompson and another SEAL carried the wounded Americans on improvised stretchers. The female soldier, Maria, was so close to death that Thompson had to monitor her pulse continuously to make sure she didn't slip away. They reached a partially destroyed mosque about 4 blocks from the original ambush site. The building provided good cover and had an open courtyard suitable for helicopter landing. Stevens called in the extraction while his team set up a defensive perimeter. The helicopter came in fast and low, taking small arms fire from several directions but managing to land safely in the courtyard. The crew included a flight surgeon who immediately took over medical care for the wounded soldiers. As they lifted off from Fallujah, Thompson continued working to keep Maria alive. Her condition had deteriorated during the movement, and she had gone into cardiac arrest twice during the tunnel fight. Each time, Thompson had managed to restart her heart, but he wasn't sure how many more times her system could handle the trauma. "What's her story?" the flight surgeon asked as he inserted a chest tube to treat a collapsed lung. "Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez. Been missing for 48 hours, Stevens replied. "We found her in a basement with 17 bullet wounds and almost no blood left. By all rights, she should be dead." The flight surgeon shook his head in amazement as he worked. "I've seen a lot of combat casualties, but never anything like this. She's got the heart of a lion." During the flight to the combat support hospital, Maria's vital signs fluctuated wildly. Several times, the medical team thought they had lost her, only to see her somehow fight back from the edge of death. It was as if her body refused to give up, even when faced with injuries that would have killed most people instantly. The other surviving soldier, Private Johnson, was stable but critical. He had a severe head injury and multiple gunshot wounds, but his prognosis was much better than Maria's. The flight surgeon focused most of his attention on keeping Maria alive during the 30-minute flight to the hospital. When they arrived at the combat support hospital, a full trauma team was waiting. The hospital had been alerted about the incoming casualties and had prepared their most experienced surgeons for what promised to be extremely challenging cases. Maria was rushed directly into emergency surgery, where a team of 3 surgeons worked for over 8 hours to repair the damage done by 17 bullets. They had to remove fragments from her liver, repair holes in her intestines, and reconstruct damaged blood vessels throughout her body. During surgery, they discovered something remarkable. Several of the bullets had missed vital organs by millimeters, and others had followed paths through her body that avoided major blood vessels by sheer chance. It was as if luck had intervened to keep her alive just long enough for rescue. The lead surgeon, Colonel Patricia Hendricks, had performed thousands of trauma surgeries during her career, but Maria's case was unique. "I've never seen anyone survive this type of injury pattern," she told Stevens after the operation. "Medically speaking, she should have died in that basement. The fact that she's still alive suggests she has an extraordinary will to live." Maria remained in critical condition for 3 weeks, fighting off infections, organ failure, and multiple complications from her injuries. The hospital staff began calling her the Miracle of Fallujah because her survival defied every medical prediction. Slowly, gradually, she began to recover. The first sign was when she squeezed a nurse's hand during a routine examination. Then she began responding to voices and simple commands. After a month, she was able to speak a few words, though she had no memory of the rescue operation or the days immediately following her injuries. When Maria was finally stable enough for visitors, Stevens came to see her in the hospital. She was still weak and connected to multiple machines, but her eyes were alert and focused. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Stevens shook his head. "Ma'am, you don't need to thank us. We're just glad we found you in time." Maria managed a weak smile. "You didn't just find me. You brought me back from the dead." 6 months later, Maria Rodriguez was medically retired from the Army and returned home to Texas. She would never fully recover from her injuries, but she was alive. Against all odds, through extraordinary medical care and sheer determination, she had survived the impossible. The story of her rescue became legendary among Special Operations Forces. But for Stevens and his team, it was simply another reminder of why they never left anyone behind. No matter how hopeless the situation might seem, sometimes miracles happened in the most unlikely places.